Good morning and welcome everyone. We are going to get started in just 1 minute with our webinar. We'll let everybody kind of get into the room and get focused, and then we will kick things off. So bear with us for just 1 minute and we'll get started. We'll give it one more minute for everyone. Okay. All right, looks like a good group joining in. I'm sure we'll have more folks joining us, but in the interest of making sure we leave lots of time for Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. And I'm going to do that by saying, welcome everyone to another MassMEDIC webinar. I'm Rachel Robinson, Chief Operating Officer at MassMEDIC. I am not the usual webinar host, but I'm thrilled to be joining you today for an excellent discussion on how proactive care can disrupt a broken healthcare system. This is a very timely conversation. I'm sure everyone has been news bombed lately with just an influx of information and what is going on with the healthcare system when it comes to pricing, payment, understanding regulatory. And there are so many things that play into our healthcare system that this conversation could not be coming, honestly, at a better time. So I have to say thank you very much to Full Spectrum for suggesting this topic, and obviously to Brandon and Mike and Matt for being willing to kind of lead this discussion for us. So just a few housekeeping tips before we get started. This webinar is recorded. So if you registered, you will receive a link to the YouTube video afterwards so that you can share this with colleagues. I also encourage you to reach out to our speakers if you have any questions. Additionally, as I said in the beginning, we would love Q&A. There is a Q&A button. It's a little question mark, should be at the bottom of your screen, depending on if you're full screen. It might be on the right-hand side. That is a great place to enter your questions throughout the webinar. Matt will kind of guide you through that at the end to answer questions. But please feel free as they come up to put your questions in the Q&A, and we would love to hear from you. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Matt to kick us off for this session.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you, MassMEDIC, for hosting this event. We're all very glad to be here. I'm going to start with some introductory slides, and really only spend a few minutes on those after we do introductions, just to set the stage, and then we're going to move into a conversation with Brandon and Mike. So without further ado, let me see if I can share my screen here, and if my co-panelists here would just give me a nod if they can see that, then all right, good to go. So again, I want to thank everyone for being here, and want to introduce the panelists we have here. For starters, we have Mike Dolphin. He's the Director of Compliance at Mayo Clinic Platform. He's involved in the governance, risk, and compliance with different aspects of medical devices in the medical device industry, and now taking that expertise and applying it to the Mayo Clinic platform. And Mike, if you wouldn't mind just taking a second to say hello, and really giving us a little bit of a background on how your role relates to connected care.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Matt, and super happy to be here. And hello, y'all from sunny Minnesota. I don't get to say that too often, but it is a beautiful week here in the Midwest. As Matt had mentioned, I'm the risk guy on this call, but I think the risks I'm going to be talking about are not the traditional kind of compliance stuff that you are hearing probably on a regular basis inside of your companies today. Kind of thinking more about the forward-thinking parts of risk if we don't promote proactive and more connected care environments in healthcare. And as you mentioned, I've got kind of a varied background, but most recently was at Medtronic for a handful of years in R&D, actually working on devices, and now taking that to Mayo Clinic in one of their more recent business startups that is hoping to connect developers in the software and AI world to physicians to help improve care. So great to be here, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Mike. Awesome to have you here. Um, Also wanted to introduce Brandon Arbiter, who is the co-founder and acting CEO of TidePool. TidePool is a a very interesting company that is at the heart of what's going on here, and Brandon spends time working with a lot of leaders in the space and really working towards that goal of patient-owned data in healthcare. And Brandon wanted to give you a chance to say hello and talk about how your work relates to connected and proactive healthcare as well.
Thanks so much, Matt, and thanks for having me on the panel today. As Matt said, I'm Brandon Arbeiter, co-founder and acting CEO of TidePool. We're a nonprofit software company building data-driven diabetes technologies. And I'm also a patient too. I personally live with type 1 diabetes, which was my motivation for starting the company 12 years ago. For the last 2 years, TidePool has been collaborating with Stanford Medicine on a proactive care initiative that has demonstrated phenomenal clinical outcomes and has been published in Nature Digital Medicine, and other places. In the last 6 months, we've been rolling it out to more health systems. I'm very excited to be talking about proactive care today. I think it is a hot topic, certainly something that is affecting the field right now and will be a lot more in the future.
Thank you, Brandon. And I'm Matt Eisendrath. I'm the president and chief commercial officer at Full Spectrum. I've been in the medical device industry pretty much my entire career on the medical device side, and then on providing product development services to a lot of large and early stage companies, bringing cutting edge solutions to the market, and see a lot of the trends that are happening in the industry, including the connectivity of devices, the flow of data, and really sets the stage nicely for what we're talking about here is how that data can help inform earlier intervention and more proactive support of patients. We're going to get into a number of different topics where we're going to get viewpoints from Mike and Brandon. Before we jump into that, just want to talk for a minute about some of the background here. We see proactive care as something that can and should be a disruptor, and we see it coming. We see some of the trends happening. We want to kind of set the stage with what do we mean by disruptor, right? And really any technology trend or shift in the industry that requires how care is provided to be rethought, right? In either all or some of the ways that healthcare is delivered. And we thought of some examples where the GLP-1s, obviously there's a lot of talk about them, right? And they have come on the scene very quickly. But the reality is that they've been in development, since the 80s. They had an initial focus on diabetes. And once, the benefits there started to be recognized, there's a number of other areas where we're seeing that it has opportunity, and obviously has had a big impact on the industry, in the sense of can it, prevent or reduce the number of certain types of conditions. And certainly we've seen market impacts in things from diabetes, but also to the obesity market, where bariatric surgery is down significantly, and these drugs are being prescribed to greater and greater numbers of patient populations. Another one I wanted to mention is the high tech changes that happened in the early 2000s, where electronic medical records were highly incentivized and pushed into the market, and that was something that was a government push, but it made electronic medical records go from this paper-based system to digital format, and it drove a massive transition in the marketplace, and it really drove the availability of digitized data. And one of the first things that popped up from a trend standpoint was population health management, was something that was enabled by that. And really what we're talking about today, some of the opportunities in proactive care are based on the fact that all of this data is now available in a different format, in a digital format, makes it remotely available, and makes it able to be analyzed to start recognizing trends to intervene earlier. So a couple of examples of some disruption that's happened in the healthcare market, and now we want to talk about how we see some of the trends enabling proactive care to really take a more prominent place in the way healthcare is delivered. So why do we hope and believe it is the next disruptor? We've got some terms over there to the right. I talked about connectivity. The fact that so many devices are connected and wearable and available means that clinicians and others within the healthcare industry can start seeing the trends in their patients and identifying trends before they become, really more significant stages of disease. And so these different ingredients, AI, wearables, connectivity, are the ingredients, right? And also there's a significant need. We hear a lot about the cost of healthcare, right? Healthcare is costing more and more as a percentage of GDP in the US. And we're not seeing the outcomes that really align with the investment. How can we move that needle? And I think that's, a passion that I know drives Mike and Brandon and myself. We want to see better outcomes. We want to see greater efficiency, and expanding access, meeting patients where they are, which can be on the body, on the phone, at home, and bringing those patients into the visibility of the clinicians at a different place. And, I won't go into too much detail about diabetes care because, Brandon has a lot of depth there and what we'll be talking about through the questions and discussion. But, the idea that, you have continuous glucose monitoring, you have insulin pumps that can be worn, that you can, sort of organize and integrate those into a more comprehensive solution. And we're seeing similar trends in cardiac care where there's a lot more cardiac monitoring happening, whether it be on a watch or on a wearable. And, what does that information tell you? And how does that enable clinicians to intervene earlier and bring better outcomes is really kind of what we're talking about today. So I'm going to stop sharing these slides and get into some questions here. And I wanted to start with something kind of fundamental. And Mike, I'm going to just ask you to answer this one first, but Brandon, want to hear your thoughts as well. What does proactive care mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks for the framing there. I think for a definition, I like to focus on kind of two major components when it comes to proactive care: the when and the how. And so when I talk about when, I think that there's a timing component, which is almost too obvious to mention out loud, but like when in the continuum of care is a patient receiving the most benefit, if you imagine on a distribution as it exists today. And I think, most of the group would probably agree that like under fee-for-service models, largely focused on interventionist types of solutions, and that you're seeing it more in kind of like the mid to late stages of somebody, suffering from some particular condition. What we're talking about here is that we want things earlier. So if you don't remember anything else that I say on this call, it's on this continuum of addressing, whatever the issue is, that it's happening earlier rather than where it is today. For individual patients. I think within that timing component, there's also a subset that talks about how fast are we able to make decisions today. And I think that we're seeing kind of a watershed moment. People say this all the time at various digital health conferences, is that, the time is now, but really that time is that, and that opportunity is only increasing as we're seeing novel technologies hit the market and overlap with critical infrastructure, including healthcare, to say that we can start making better decisions faster, and that it's incumbent on us to make sure that we're doing that. So I think that that's kind of the when. The how is exactly what Matt had just mentioned as well, which is many people have been wondering, how can we improve the patient experience and improve outcomes under traditional care models? And I think what we're saying here, at least for the group to consider and bring back to your organizations, is, are we being comprehensive enough in our view about how care is being delivered today? And we're already seeing early signals of this today, whether it was, incentives being rolled out when COVID was kind of at its height, but also an appetite even by policymakers today to continue to support distributed care models, whether it be care at home or on my watch here or it's on my phone. Every consumer in the U.S. has these tools on them today. And so that's the how component, I think, is how do we meet them where they're at? And that to me, I think provides a pretty good view about what we're describing when we say what does proactive care mean.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike, very much. Brandon, be very curious to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think there has always been a dichotomy in healthcare where you have inpatient care when the patient is in the hospital or with their doctor, and then the patient goes home. In diabetes, this is a huge issue. We call it a self-managed disease. You are supposed to manage the condition yourself in the comfort of your own home. You're allowed to see your doctor 4 times a year, and the other 99% of the time, you're on your own. Um, when a patient leaves the doctor, there's always been a gap, right? What's happening for these 3 months where the patient is away? But with today's technology, with connected devices, we can now fill that gap, right? It's gone from dichotomy to kind of a continuous spectrum of engagement. Um, so I think part one of what is proactive care is connectivity. The doctor continuing to see the patient when the patient is not even there, and connected devices can support that. Two is algorithmic risk stratification. The doctor or the clinician does not need to be looking at all of the patients all of the time. With data flowing in, there's an opportunity to stratify those patients into risk buckets and make sure that the clinic office is only looking at the patients who might actually be needing help this week or today. And finally, supporting data review and outbound communication at the top of the license. I've been talking a lot about the doctor, but we all know that the doctor is not the only person in the office. And the doctor is probably not the right person to be reviewing dashboards like this. It can actually be reviewed by a medical assistant. It can be escalated through a protocol depending on what situation is emerging in the data so that anybody in that clinician's office is operating at the top of their license. And then by the time the patient comes back in for their next appointment, 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months later, they might be doing a lot better than they otherwise would have been because when things fell off the tracks while the patient was at home, there was a proactive engagement. So to me, that's what I see as proactive care.
Matt, can I jump in on that too? Just because I think like Brandon just mentioned something so critical there, which is
Absolutely.
almost like, and Brandon, you can slide me on the wrist here if I'm mischaracterizing this, but like the almost like the democratization of like who these solutions are going to and kind of spreading that out to not just the physician staff, but other frontline staff and administrative staff. And I can tell you today, like our business and platform is to look at third-party solutions. We're kind of are what we say we are. We're trying to act as this middle conduit between people developing solutions and the consumers of those solutions, largely health systems to begin with. And we'll say things like, boy, for something like population health tooling, just to get people to be identified if they're at higher risk for kind of known screenings that need to happen, depending on where you are, where you are today, that administrative process can be a mess. And the solution to that is not going to go to a physician today. It's going to go to some other hospital administrator. And are the people who are developing these things thinking about their user base in a more broad way so that they're getting to the right people for the greatest benefit? And so I just think that point that Brandon made is super, super important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please, I always want to hear your thoughts and sort of expanded answers. So don't hold back at all. I appreciate that. I think it's good to sort of, what are we talking about here? And get your viewpoints on it. We've touched on some of this a little bit, But I think there's more, which is, through enabling and sort of having more buy-in and use of proactive care models, what potential benefits does that bring to the patients? And let's start with you on this one, Brandon.
Sure. So, I talked before about scheduled care, right? I'm going to schedule my doctor's appointment. I have this problem more and more often that when I have a problem and I need to see the doctor and I call to make the appointment, it's like the appointment's 3 weeks out, 3 months out. Oh, I might not even have the problem anymore. And so much of clinical care today is delivered at the wrong time. And it's an incredible inefficiency in our system. When we move to a proactive care model, the patient can get the care actually when they need it, when it is relevant to them. And it just makes those interactions and engagements with the health system more effective. I think that's just a huge benefit to the patient. Living with diabetes, there are good weeks and bad weeks, right? That is very true. There are good weeks and bad weeks, and good months and bad months. And if you go in for a doctor's appointment when you've had 2 great weeks, all they're going to do is look at your last 2 weeks of data. They're going to pat you on the back and send you on your way. So it's much better to go in and see your endocrinologist or your diabetes educator when you're having a rough week, when you're training for a half marathon, or you, for whatever reason, have a different food regimen introduced into your house and you need to try to figure out how to cope with it. Um, so I think that this benefit to the patient is getting the care when it's relevant to you instead of getting the care when the health system can fit you into their schedule.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think timeliness is an issue that I at least hear, people struggle with. Mike, love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I agree with everything Brandon said. I think for me it kind of boils down to this idea of as manufacturers of device or people who are who believe that this is the path forward, are we ensuring that our cultures have the appropriate amount of empathy for patients across segments, across the country, across the any market in the world, if you're a global outfit, for what those patient populations look like. And the reason why I point that out is because today, we think about not just patients who are sitting on First Street down in Rochester, Minnesota, and they're next to this amazing academic medical center, and that's an incredible a benefit to them to have that closer proximity. What about the patients who are living in rural North Dakota who just found out that they have cancer and it's really hard for them to get to the clinic to get their infusion therapies? Are there paths forward to work both across policy but also operationally and with technology to provide things like an infusion therapy at home, and that would also incentivize device companies and payers and providers to meet patients where they are, so that logistical concern, those things like, is it hard to get to the place? Are we considering that and getting proactive and meeting patients, kind of that how component I talked about earlier? I think helps address that. Of course, there's cost. We think like, even if it's higher up front, we think that curve starts to smooth out and adds and works to our benefit, because technology, I forget is that Moore's law, like it will continue to improve at an exponential rate or whatever. And so we think it will also become hopefully cheaper. And that's why everybody has a smartphone when that was a luxury a decade ago. And I think, lastly is accuracy of diagnoses. We're seeing models come through today that are not replacing physicians, but like they are, because there's so much more data coming in at real time, are able to learn and develop and become just a far greater tool to physicians today once they're adopted. And of course, increased accuracy in diagnoses is ultimately going to help the patient, especially when it's earlier, like Brandon mentioned.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. And that is a challenge of getting timely and accurate diagnosis. And one of the things we're talking about is a richer set of data and better, algorithmic analysis of that data, maybe from multiple viewpoints to try to get to a better diagnosis faster, which can be a real pain point, I know, in the patient journey. Looking beyond just the patient, how does proactive care address problems within the existing healthcare system? Mike, if you want to jump on that first.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you believe our theory of the case, and that's a big if, across this group and across healthcare, but if you believe that it will result in decreased costs overall to patients and allow health systems to take on more patients because they won't be as strapped as they are today, and of course there's a payer component in there, then you'll agree with me that having greater connected care and getting to patients earlier will result in an overall reprieve for the U.S. healthcare system for all the various costs that are figured into that model. I think like I just gave a talk about a month ago. I got to keep on looking at my notes here, but I just gave a talk about a month ago where I was reading through a Peterson Institute report on what is the rising cost in healthcare relative to GDP, and we're looking to exceed overall GDP in this country with the cost of healthcare in the next decade, which I'll just pause there for a second, and hopefully that's saturating in everybody's brains. Is kind of a terrifying concept. I don't use that term loosely, but somebody has to account for that for the gap in those two rate increases, and secondly, I guess I would say that this isn't a recent problem, but if you look at the mortality and morbidity tables for the last century in the United States, the frequent flyers are the ones who are at the top of that table. All chronic conditions that we think about today, and regardless of what I'm not insane enough to make this a political discussion, but like regardless of what you think of the current administrations and the agency regimes that are out there, a focus on chronic conditions is always primary for us in healthcare, and I think it's getting to patients earlier for those things that we know behavioral change can have material effects is kind of what we're talking about. So yes, it's leveraging technology, yes, it's leveraging device, but how do you coalesce that with a patient and their behavioral characteristics now to fight the things that we know are hurting us the most and have been for a very long time?
No, thank you, Mike. Brandon?
Yeah, Mike was talking about frequent flyers. And generally, we think of frequent flyers as the people who are frequently being admitted to the ED, right? Rather than going in for, they're not frequently going in for, check-ins with their physician. And like, why is that? I was having a conversation with an incredible endocrinologist out of Yale. This was probably 2 years ago now. And I was asking her, like, what is the thing that is most frustrating about her job? And she said, the people that I spend most of my time on, Brandon, are the people with diabetes like you. The people who are getting great outcomes because they come in for 4 visits a year. In between visits, they, if there's a blip in their data and their results, they send me a message on my chart. They ask me to review it. They ask me for feedback. And who doesn't get seen? It's the kid with diabetes who's got a single parent, who's working 2 jobs, who does not have time to make an appointment, or whose supplies, whose diabetes supplies don't get shipped to them for some reason, and they don't have the literacy skills to advocate for themselves and to solve a conflict between a supply distributor and an insurance company. And they don't think to contact their physician's office who actually could resolve the problem for them. So we get this bifurcation of care where the people with flexible schedules, with resources, get great care and great outcomes. The people who are more constrained, who have more socioeconomic challenges, end up not getting great care. And this is where a proactive paradigm can level the playing field, right? Because if those diabetes supplies that are not getting shipped, if they are generating on-body data that gets sent to the clinician and that data feed suddenly stops, That is an alert in the proactive care dashboard. That is a cause for a phone call. I saw this happen 4 months ago in one of our pilots. Exactly this situation. Patient, under-resourced patient who generally has poor outcomes was put on a continuous glucose monitor. That data was being fed into the clinician's office continuously through our platform. And all of a sudden, the data stopped coming in. Within 24 hours, the patient got a phone call. It turns out that there was a supply issue. Clinician's office solved it. 24 hours after that, patient was back on these devices. In general, when this happens without proactive care, it's going to be 9 months before that patient's back in the doctor's office, and they're going to have 9 months without the standard of care devices and support. So all of that leads to frequent flyer, because if you're not monitoring your glucose, you're at risk for severe hypoglycemia, severe hyperglycemia, and DKA, which can absolutely result in a hospitalization. This is where the frequent flyers come in. So we have a way now through connectivity to actually identify the problems before they happen, and address them. Again, the physician didn't even need to get involved. A medical assistant took care of this whole thing. So I think that this is a fundamental problem in our healthcare system, this bifurcation of people with the most resources get the best care, everyone else gets left behind, and ends up being a huge cost on our system.
Great points, guys. Really, really appreciate it. Brandon, I want to stick with you for a minute and, kind of continue on what you started there. I love that story, right? There's nothing like a real world story of how this is working to provide access and better care for someone who may typically get left behind. But beyond that story, what does the world look like when proactive care is the standard of care, when we're seeing this more pervasively in how care is delivered?
So one thing that we have learned is that there are certain windows of opportunity for proactive care. It is not a one size fits all. There are a lot of folks who have developed certain habits and they're not really interested in hearing from a clinician's office off schedule. But there's those windows where it works, right? Right after a diagnosis, it works. Right after a hospitalization, it works. When you're introduced to a new drug or therapy, it works. I think that, and then by enrolling in those windows, you learn great behaviors that are not really going to, if you learn bad habits and then you try to, it's like a golf swing. It's like if you learn how to do it wrong, correcting it is much harder than like trying to learn how to do it right the first time. So there's these windows where it is most effective. And I think the world when proactive care is the standard of care looks like people learning how to manage their disease the right way from the beginning. And that in and of itself is going to result in much better care throughout. The other thing that it looks like is a more equitable system where health outcomes aren't determined by social determinants of health. Outcomes are maybe they're determined by the quality of the proactive care program.
Thank you, Brandon. Mike, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, yeah, I think that was an excellent response. Maybe just a couple of things from the because I think Brand does such a good job kind of like framing up what this looks like for patients, and that's primary. I think from the provider side of thing, look, I mean, standard of care can be a term. It is a term of art when it comes to healthcare provision, not just here in the States, but globally. And changing a standard or any kind of change management, I'm sure everybody on the call would probably agree, is a painful exercise and sometimes can take a long time. And there's going to be detractors and people who are incentivized to operate under the current, standard of care as it exists today, and that's fine. I think what we're saying is bring them all in. And there's kind of there's this flip saying that I had heard recently at a conference where it was, if you can change things in two different ways. One is, you build something that's so compelling that people just can't ignore it. It's just so good. And the other one is the government made you do it. Okay, well, we're not saying the government has to make you do it here, but we are saying that building consensus in industry associations amongst providers is key to making this reality, because they're the ones who are going to be using it. But again, I'll go back to what we were talking about earlier, is that group of people who are going to be leveraging this connected technology and getting to patients earlier is much larger than what we think about today when we think about like direct care models. And so the standard of care, once it changed, I think includes the voices of all those people who are actually going to be using these things. And then we have to just face head on. And there's been legislation over the last decade, and really kind of the pump has been primed on this in the last couple of years, talking about imputations of liability and all these other boring legalese terms that nobody here wants to talk about for folks who are going to use novel technologies. Are you ensuring that you're not missing people? Protected classes. Let's say, for instance, there's a section under the Affordable Care Act that talks about, like, if you're going to use AI in your provision of care, like, you need to make sure that you're not operating with models that have such a bias that would leave certain classes of patients out. Super important. The way that we address that problem in the platform, and our theory of the case, is broaden the data, have it be more heterogeneous, increase the depth, breadth, and spread of all data globally, and then in a very safe and secure way, allow developers to come in and build their technologies off of that so that it fits that first bucket. It's so compelling and so good that you can't ignore it. And once you get a critical mass, then hopefully, providers and their staffs will create the change that we think is needed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you guys have done a great job of painting the picture of why this is such a compelling change to make, and really not just make, because I think it's already started, but really expand on and accelerate. Patients, who are getting to a stage with their disease that they're really, far along and in a severe state, it is hard to bring them back to the point quickly and inexpensively and without a lot of pain, to a point where they're, enjoying their lives, productive members of society. And a lot of what you're talking about is getting more people access to better care earlier and avoiding some of those deeper dips that really hurts everybody, right? And so it is compelling. Why isn't it happening yet, right? And this is where I think, it's really important to talk about what are some of the barriers and obstacles here. And Mike, as a risk guy and a lawyer, let's start with you.
Yeah. Hey, look, somebody's got to pay for this. Okay. That's just the reality of it. Long term, somebody has to pay for all this, and people have to be bought in at various points in the continuum of care to help support this thing financially and operationally within their organizations. And this is a group of, I think, largely device makers. And so I think we know what our charge is, which is, let's hit the gas on creating devices that are connected, that are targeting patients or not targeting patients, but meeting patients where they are in these distributed settings. Great. We also have to be able to make sure that providers are incentivized to use those solutions that we're all making. And that has directly to do with reimbursement and the adoption and inculcation of these devices and other digital health solutions into this bucket of things that can be reimbursed upon. And then it's payer buy-in as well. So it's the three major pillars of the healthcare system agreeing that this is how we're going to fund it from a financial perspective. That's a major headwind right now, because getting policy changes through is really tough. But we have to face that challenge head on. I think the others are greater democratization to data. I love talking to Brandon in preparation for this conversation, because he sees it from a connected care lens of how can we push out patient data. It's almost from like the patient viewed perspective. That's redundant. From the patient perspective, I'm talking about how do we get these institutions, which have, to a large degree, been siloed by things like regulation and other operational considerations, to start sharing data in a more clear and transparent way, while protecting all those things like the privacy and security of patients, while protecting intellectual property and all the other things. These are all challenges, but greater data democratization has to be a part of the challenge set that we overcome. And then lastly, Matt, and I'll shut up, is full connectivity into physician workflow for these solutions. So it's really hard to get, and I shouldn't just say physicians, but any users within health systems to adopt solutions and surface them up to one day become the standard of care if it's hard for them to use. And so if you think about the electronic medical record we mentioned at the beginning of the talk, having connectivity into that location for the care teams of these patients is absolutely critical. And we need to knock down barriers that exist today. There's been several running starts at that, but like really putting teeth to bringing in device and other technologies to make it easy for physicians and other folks to use is critical.
Thanks, Mike. Brandon?
I was having a conversation with the CFO of a major health system about implementing a proactive care program recently, and he said, so let me start off by saying there are some fundamental perverse incentives, financial incentives in our healthcare system today. And this CFO of this health system said to me, we make a lot of money with our hospital beds being filled. If we invest in a program that keeps people out of the hospital beds, it actually will cause us to lose money. This is a perverse incentive. Like he doesn't have KPIs other than in value-based care, but this is a predominantly fee-for-service health system. So he doesn't have KPIs around patient health. He has KPIs that are financially driven. So this is barrier number one, right? Is these perverse financial incentives. He said, listen, I want to do this. Let's figure out how to do this. But I have to be honest with you. We're going to have to do this by getting the right people into the room and thinking about doing it from the goodness of our hearts, because it is not aligned with the KPIs that we're measured on. So, okay, problem number one, we have some perverse financial incentives in the system. Problem number two, staffing. You can't just take an existing clinician's office and then put in a proactive care system. There are workflow changes. It is a different workflow. It might require actually more personnel at the bottom of the spectrum, right? Who can review the dashboard and make those introductory calls. Now, if you're looking to hire nurses or diabetes educators, there are a lot of diabetes clinics, especially those affiliated with health systems, who do not employ their own nurses and diabetes educators. The health system employs them. They're not part of the endocrinology budget. They're part of the health system hospital budget. And so if the diabetes clinic wants more of this kind of staff, they need to go to the hospital and say, we need you to hire a couple more nurses or diabetes educators to assign to us. Well, if revenue from RPM is coming into the diabetes clinic, but they're not allowed to hire diabetes educators or nurses to actually deploy the program, there's so much logistics to negotiate, across the health system to get this thing staffed. So staffing is a barrier. And then device accessibility. And Mike was talking about this. You have a device. Does the data have cloud-to-cloud capabilities? It's 2025. A lot of these devices do not. It is astonishing. If your device does have cloud-to-cloud capabilities, is there like an open data policy where the device maker freely allows you as a patient to share that data with whatever app or service you want? Or does the device maker like actually keep it in a closed box in a walled garden, where as a patient or as a clinician, you don't get to choose how that data moves? So that happens a lot. These, I think, are some real barriers that we face when we're trying to see a successful national rollout of proactive care.
Randy, you hit on something there that I think is important, and at Full Spectrum, we work with a lot of medical device manufacturers, right? And this isn't all about the technology, right? But the technology is an enabler, and there's a lot of other things that we talked about. Policy, Mike, you hit some of those, you both did. But if we think about it from the lens of medical device manufacturers, what kind of changes and considerations do they need to be having on their radar and thinking about in order to support this and also benefit from it?
You want me to take that, Matt?
Yeah, Brandon, if you wouldn't mind starting.
So, I think part one is understanding that the more data flexibility you build into your platform, the more value it is going to add to patients, and the more it is going to be recommended by providers. So providing API access with minimal restrictions, so you're not blocking access to data. I've seen this done in a number of ways. There's a full spectrum of ways that you can do this, and one way is like the Apple Health Kit way, where we're putting the data out there. You can do anything you want with it. Another way is we'll put the data out there, but we're going to make you sign a contract where you're not going to use our data to develop IP that competes against us. Honestly, okay, that kind of seems fair. Like maybe it's not very patient focused, but I get it. Then we're going to put the data out there, but you have to check in with us on a scenario by scenario basis, on a health system by health system basis. And we will tell you whether or not you can use this data to support this health system. Okay. Now this seems a little odd. And then we're just not going to put our data out there. There's no one's going to have access to this data but our company. And I think that this spectrum is something that device makers need to get kind of honest with themselves about. What are they here for? And how can we do the right thing to promote patient health, which ultimately I believe will come back to adding more value to their company. But these are the policies, and I think that within any device company, you're going to get conflicting viewpoints, right? Some people are going to think this data is gold and it's our gold, and we can't let anyone touch it. And then there's going to be other people who think this data is critical to improving patient care, and we need to get this data out there, unrestricted. So this is something that I think that device makers are talking about already. And I hope that over time, they're moving more towards, unfiltered data access to patients and providers with no restrictions.
Thanks, Brandon. Mike, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, plus one on what Brandon just said. I mean, look, this is way oversimplifying the problem, but remote monitoring. This is a bold prediction, and maybe it's not a prediction, maybe it's already real. But like, let what's going to become commoditized. Just let it happen, and focus on the parts of your portfolio, if you agree with us, that are going to get to patients earlier. So I think, namely, talking about diagnostics and for those who are in kind of the wearable world, incentivizing patients to adjust behaviors and meet them again where they are. Like, that's your goal, and have the data sharing flow freely, because RPM solutions, I don't know if anybody on this call is planning on hanging their hat on that moving forward as their unique value. I think the unique value is when you develop these partnerships with healthcare providers and healthcare providers globally, because that's where the value of the data sits. If we only served up Mayo Clinic data through our platform, we would be far less valuable because everybody would look like they came from Norway or Sweden or Germany or Ireland, and we wouldn't really know how to address various patient populations across the globe, which is our job. And so I think if that's your view, that's your company's view, and you look to expand and grow, which I'm guessing most folks on the call are, like that is your charge, is to let the currency flow more freely here and focus on the value of the individual solutions, and then also making it useful and easy for the people who are actually going to use these things. That's where you hit your stride. That's what I would advise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really appreciate those perspectives. I wanted to grab one of the questions that came in from the audience. When more proactive care is added, it always tends to add cost to the system. How can automation and AI alleviate this? Maybe we'll start with you, Brandon, since Mike just wrapped up.
Sure. First, I want to address the first part of the question, that it always tends to add cost to the system. You might be doing things wrong if it's adding cost to the system. Proactive care is billable, and so you can get reimbursement for it. There are RPM codes that can be deployed. It should also, in a value-based care world, it should improve outcomes. So, you can improve how you do with HEDIS measures. You can get more payments that way. It should reduce admissions. So there's a lot of ways it can reduce cost to the system and increase revenue to the system. Let's start there. There is work to implement it, however. So automation and AI. What we have seen work is, for instance, risk stratification. So that is an automated way to sort through all of the patients in the system to understand who needs help today. That works. What we're still trying to figure out is outbound communication. What works with what patients? Do they need a phone call? Do they need a text message? Do they need a MyChart message? We just did a pilot with a couple of health systems, and we went all in, not all in, but we went pretty heavy on testing text messages. And almost every patient said they prefer text messages. But what shocked us was they weren't responding to text messages. They'd pick up the phone if we called, the health system called, and they'd respond to emails and MyChart messages. But interestingly, and I wonder if it's like we're getting out of an election cycle and everyone's been spammed on their text messages with all these political candidates. Maybe people are just sick of text messaging like this particular month or year. But I think Ravi, to answer your question, we have to do a lot more experimentation on automation and AI. One thing I've heard at scale, if you're doing a lot of outbound calling, you can use automation and AI to actually initiate the phone call. And then when the patient picks up the phone, it gets transferred to, a nurse or whoever's running the program, rather than having humans actually doing the dialing. Now, that's again at scale, but in terms of the communication with the patient, I think we need to do a lot more experimentation. This is where we're just kind of at the beginning of proactive care.
Thanks, Brandon. Mike, any thoughts on Ravi's question?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, that idea that to make a tectonic shift, and I don't think that's wrong to probably call it that, is I think your mind probably goes to, and this is natural, I think, for anybody's mind to go to, is like, what are the capital costs up front, and the resourcing and the time to value on the returns, all fair questions. My comments today aren't representing Mayo Clinic, although I work for them, but I will cite, like, Mayo just invested a $5 billion check into totally revamping its campus in Rochester, which is its primary campus. We've got others in Arizona and Florida, and we've got reach around the world. But on this main campus, where many patients from around the world come, we're totally revamping this project, and I encourage the group to take a look at that. That wouldn't be done, at least we hope that wouldn't be done if there wasn't an intense financial analysis on, is the juice worth the squeeze, given all the other various market factors that are out there today, to completely revamp the #1 academic medical center in the world at this time, at this juncture, unless they had a vision about where care is going to go. And their theory, and I think what we're talking about here is it's going to change how patients come into a clinic and how we meet them. And so serious institutions are thinking about the cost benefit analysis here. I agree with what Brandon had mentioned as well, as like, you know, automation and AI are still very, very early. And so how do they help directly with, markets of efficiency? We're figuring that out. But I can tell you today, like we have software developing companies coming in to tune models, to work on models, and they are able to do it in orders of magnitude faster today because they have access to generative AI capabilities that they didn't have, and those things are getting better every day. And so, yeah, I just think the possibilities are very great when it comes to using that to help us get more efficient.
Thank you, Mike. I mean, that's a great real world example of a leading institution looking to the future and making an investment that resonates with what we're talking about here, and it's really encouraging. I could talk to you guys all day. I really enjoyed. I see Rachel here, which makes me think that close to an hour must have gone by. I do see one other question, but Rachel, keep us honest on time.
No. I think I always have questions, but I think you can take one more question. You've got 3 minutes. I say go for it.
All right. So from Graham here, wanted the panel to comment on the following. Is there any evidence that different generations or cohorts of patients are more or less engaged with digital health platforms? Great question. Challenging one. I'll let you guys decide who wants to take that one first.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So certainly we see that. Who has an iPhone, who has an Android, and who doesn't even have a smartphone? Who has access to Wi-Fi and who does not have access to Wi-Fi? There are certainly cohorts who have varying degrees of access, 100%. There's also, some things are a little harder to control than others, right? That's hard to control or solve for. There's also questions of just who in the time of their health journey is, most suited for engagement, that new diagnosis or that particularly challenging week. There are folks, there are parts of the health journey that are more likely to be successful with proactive care. So yes, there are certainly, generations and cohorts that engage with technology differently, for sure. But even of the people who do have access to this technology, there are people who are more and less likely to be successful, or people at times of their life where they are more unlikely to be successful. And it's not necessarily generational. It's actually this wave of where you are in your chronic condition journey.
Thanks, Brandon. Mike, if you have a quick one, I think we're close, but
It's well said. Yep, agree.
All right.
I'm so glad you took that question because I actually think that's an incredible response, but also a really good question. So I have to thank our panelists, Matt, Mike, and Brandon. That was an incredible discussion and very, very interesting. Some of the things that obviously jumped out to me is understanding what the value is in hospital. I think understanding that hospitals are built to make money. And this is a very interesting conflict that you're facing when you try to bring in new technology and understanding where folks' priorities are and that they would really like to adopt new technology, but you have to understand how it fits their business model. And I think it's an incredible point. So I just want to say thank you to the three of you. That was an incredible discussion. Thank you, Full Spectrum, for suggesting this topic. And thank you to everyone for sticking with us for another incredible webinar. I look forward to seeing you again soon at an upcoming program.
Thanks for hosting, Rachel.
Thanks, Joe.
Have a great one, guys.
Take care.
Bye.